So hello everyone, greetings one more time. Thank you so much for being here with us today as we host Dr. Carol Ferrara from Emerson College. My name is Derya Doğan, and I am the graduate student coordinator of the Muslim Voices Public Scholarship Project, which is the organizer entity of this webinar. Our Muslim Voices Project was established in 2008 here at Indiana University Bloomington with the aims of helping dismantle Islamophobia and present the diversity of the Muslim world as accurately as possible without creating further bias and stereotypes about Muslims and the Islamic faith. Inshallah. Currently, this project is supervised by the Center for the Study of Global Change, our home unit, along with the Center for the Study of the Middle East and the African Studies program. This specific event is also co-sponsored by the Institute for European Studies. All of these units that I just mentioned are national resource centers here at Indiana University, funded by the Department of Education Title VI grant. Dr. Ferrara is an anthropologist and assistant professor in the Marketing Communication Department at Emerson College. Her research has focused on the intersection of religion, education, and national identity. She has published several articles and book chapters about religious education, private Muslim schooling, and secularism in France. Her new research project focuses on family expectations of education as it relates to improving information equity in Boston's school choice system. Her courses in marketing communication encourage students to innovate, reimagine, and rethink processes and structures to make marketing and businesses better, smarter, and more socially and environmentally responsible. Carol also serves as the co-chair for the American Academy of Religion in Europe program unit. Her book, Muslim and Catholic Experiences of National Belonging in France, explores how the differing experiences of national identity and belonging for French Muslims and Catholics reveal the inequities that marginalize minorities in plural secular societies. Drawing on extensive ethnographic fieldwork in France, Dr. Ferrara challenges popular explanations for Muslim exclusion, arguing that the boundaries of French belonging are shaped by francité, a tacit national ideal that perpetuates cognitive biases and undermines Republican values. She contends that addressing these biases requires reframing national identity narratives and reimagining the inclusive potential of secular democratic values. It was exactly 2 years and 2 days ago that we, the Muslim Voices Public Scholarship Project, hosted Dr. Ferrara here on our campus with another scholar to speak on a panel about the controversy around the Islamic practice of hijab, meaning the headscarf. Because I found Carol to be such a cool person, I kept in touch with her by bugging her on an occasional basis until her book came out last September. She was generous enough to provide me with a copy of her book, which I'm grateful for. And I was able to read it for this webinar. So I came prepared, Carol. Without further ado, I would like to pass the virtual floor to her to present her 10 years of research in France and publication that came out of it.
Thank you so much, Derya, and thank you to all of the institutions that you mentioned at Indiana University for hosting me and giving me this opportunity to present my book, which, as you noted, is it's a really long time coming. So I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to you and all your work in putting this together. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And it's really ironic that you happen to bring up the headscarf, because that is where I'm actually going to begin this book talk. So I don't know if any of you know about the headscarf debate in France, but that is what brought me to Indiana University the first time, and it's also what sparked my interest in this research in the first place. So the headscarf debate, the headscarf affair started in 1989, and for those of you who study France and secularism or anything having to do with Islam, I'm sorry, because this is it feels old and tired. It's been now 20 years since 2004, when the headscarf was actually banned from public schools. What this meant was that Muslim girls were not allowed to wear their headscarf in school, and so they were asked to remove their headscarf before entering into the school. The headscarf affair, like I said, started in 1989, and by 2004, it was officially banned. There's also been attempts to ban it from universities and other settings, but that has not yet been successful. So I'm in France in 2004, and I'm talking to some family friends that I had. So that explains sort of my history of knowing about France, being interested in France. And they're talking about the headscarf debate. I've known them my whole lives, and I really love being with them and spending time with them. But they were for this headscarf ban. And I thought to myself, that's so strange. As an American growing up in even rural American, but as a liberal young person, I couldn't understand why there was this strong desire to tell young Muslim girls what they could and could not wear to school, especially when it came to their religious identity. So this, I've used this photo as my entree here, because it's also my entree into my research. Way before I was even studying France, before I studied Islam, before I studied anthropology, before all of it, in 2004, I was actually an international business major at Rochester Institute of Technology. So again, this picture is important because it's really symbolic of my research and symbolic of the situation in France. So it's a really salient issue there. And the reason why it was banned from school was because of this quote unquote staunch secularism that France is known for having. And I thought that was really interesting. So secularism in France tends to emphasize the strong privatization of religion, the removal of religion from the public sphere as much as possible. And this looks really different. Obviously, secularism looks really different in the US context, as many of you might know. So plenty of folks were studying Islam sort of, in a silo, looking at Islam in France, studying Islam in various contexts. In the Global West, that's actually the book series that this book is published with Bloomsbury in. But there were very few studies that studied Islam as a minority religion juxtaposed with a majority religion. So you may or may not know that France has a strong Catholic heritage and history. So I thought, what better way to better understand the situation of Muslims who continuously felt oppressed or marginalized or like they didn't belong, than to look at Catholics and try and understand how they found belonging. And so that juxtaposition is what drew me in to this research. So what was I doing when I was there? So as Daria pointed out, it's more than a decade of research, and this included many different trips to France, but it really all started in 2013 when I left to do my dissertation fieldwork. So I was there from 2013 to 2015. I came back basically in January of 2015, which was right, I don't know if anyone remembers, but right at the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks. So obviously the context changed enormously. There were several terror attacks that year in France, which really the issue of Islam in France has already been a very salient topic for decades, but this really brought things to a head, and there were lots of legal changes, et cetera. So my research continued, even though I wasn't in the field. And then in 2019 and 2020, I had the opportunity to return to France as a Fulbright postdoc scholar, and continued research. Primarily, this was with the Catholic communities, the traditionalist Catholic communities that I'll get into in a moment. And I took what I claim is a juxtapositional approach. So this is different from a comparative approach that might look for similarities between these experiences necessarily, or a contrasting approach that might expect or assume that those experiences are necessarily going to be different. Instead, just taking them as they are, recognizing it's apples and oranges, not apples and apples, because of the really different histories of Islam and Muslims in France versus Catholics and Catholicism in France. So that's what I call a juxtapositional approach. So I spent 15 months of fieldwork in various parts of France, mostly, as you can see in the purple circles there, in Paris and the suburbs, in Lille and those suburbs, and in Lyon and those suburbs. So all around, and in various other parts as my research took me for meetings all over the place, sometimes in really unexpected locations. And I conducted more than 100 interviews with anyone from recent high school graduates from these private Muslim schools, which were salient or really important sites for my research, to senior Muslim leaders, to the cardinals. So I met with the Archbishop of Lyon at the time, who was a cardinal. He is no longer a cardinal, which that's a story for maybe the Q&A or another time. But basically, I was interviewing folks and hanging out in these sites of religious education broadly defined. So that meant, again, the private Muslim schools were a particularly interesting case. They were schools where folks were really trying hard to teach young Muslims that they were also French and they were allowed to also be French, and really teach them the basics of, French Muslim identity. And then I was also in, and they were playing by all the French Republican rules, and they still found that the barriers against their success were really, really high. Oh dear. Sorry. There we go. So their barriers for success were still really high, and so that really stood out to me as being a really important case to show how, like, the consequences of non-belonging in France. Other places I went to religious education classes in mosques. I went to catechism classes in churches. I spent many, many Saturdays in a row attending catechism classes in certain churches. And I attended countless interfaith events. This was a place where I wanted to see how the dynamics between the two religions were, and especially those power dynamics, to sort of understand how folks came to the table, and see how things evolved and how it intersected with French national identity. So before I can go much further, it is important that we cover the basics of religion in France, so faith in the Republic, which is one of the subtitles of the book. So, as I said, France is really known these days for being a particularly secular society, secular culture. And we can see this, there's a couple of numbers that really stand out here. The first one that is actually not circled is this 53% of no religion, so not affiliated with any religion. This study came out in 2023, so it's the first time when the nuns, another word for those who don't have any religious affiliation, exceeded 50%. So that is notable. The other really remarkable thing, especially from my study, is this 25% number. So for the first time in decades, we go from, in 2009, you have 43% affiliated with Catholicism, down to 25%. And that jump is the biggest that we've seen, again, in decades. So really significant pulling away of affiliation with Catholicism. The Muslim population has slowly been growing. It sort of always has hovered somewhere around 10%, more or less. The other important thing to note here is the 6% of Catholics feel that religion is an important part of their identity. So they see themselves, I would argue that we would interpret this by saying they see themselves as French first and as Catholics second. And that's really important to note as we move forward to the next slide. And then Muslims, for example, think of their religious identity as being much more important to their identity as a whole. So those are the important numbers to note here. So now, as we take that, we think of that 25%, okay? So we think, well, gosh, what's the point of studying a minority versus a minority? Well, the reason is that contrary to this 25%, 84% of French think that France is a country of Catholic culture and tradition. So this study actually came out after the book was already finished, and so it's not actually part of the book, but it resonates with several other studies that were done before, where folks, even if they don't believe themselves, they don't identify as Catholic, they still understand France as being a Catholic country. And this came up over and over again. Again, here I was speaking with Catholics and Muslims who were pious French citizens, but this idea of France being Catholic was really important to the French Catholics I spoke with, was often pointed out by the French Muslim youth I spoke with, and folks who were non-believers that I encountered during my research, weren't necessarily part of it, consistently said either France is a strongly secular country or that France is a Catholic country, or they would say both actually quite frequently. Okay, so boundaries in the Republic. So I just want to start off by sharing these two vignettes that are in the beginning of the book and really help to situate my my research overall. So Aisha was 22 when I met her. And she grew up, she was a friend of a friend who was happy to talk to me about my research and interested in the topic. She'd grown up in the suburbs of Paris. And the suburbs of Paris is the 93rd department, the northern suburbs. It's often referred to either as a ghetto, obviously pejorative, or as the Mecca of France. The Mecca of France because there tends to be a significant Muslim population in that area. France has laws against collecting statistics that can prove that, but everyone sort of knows that there's a significant Muslim population there. And so Aisha grew up surrounded by folks who generally looked like her, were like her, more or less. When she was younger, she wanted to be a deputy. She wanted to really make a difference and contribute to the betterment of French society. And she played by all of the secular French Republican rules. This meant when she started wearing the headscarf in high school, she would come to the gates of the high school, take off her headscarf, go to school, come back out, put it back on, and go on her way. So even though the secular Republican values sort of rubbed up against her way of life, she was happy to comply with them, again, in the interest of the betterment of French society and potentially being a deputy one day. And however, when I met her, she was in a really different place. So Aisha was always, did really well in school, and she managed to get into Sciences Po, which is one of the most prestigious political science universities in France, and was also known in her community in the 93rd for being relatively welcoming to lots of different folks. So this was the reputation it had. So when she got there, she was really surprised and disappointed to find herself not feeling like she belonged. Part of this stemmed from coming from the 93rd and going to Sciences Po. Sciences Po is in the very heart of Paris. If anyone's been there, it's in the 6th arrondissement, notably right next to the church, or very close to the church that my next character attended. And so that juxtaposition from the suburbs to the ghettoized, or at least folks would call it the ghettoized suburbs, to this heart of Paris offered a really different image of what Frenchness meant. And she suddenly felt this strong sense of non-belonging, much stronger than she had ever growing up, even though those narratives were always in the back of her mind growing up. This really, hit hard. And so when I met her, she had dropped out of Sciences Po, which was a really, surprising thing to do. And she had turned back towards religion, and she was actively seeking a way to get out of France. She said to me, honestly, in this moment, being French means forgetting oneself. We forget ourselves. France has always taught me to forget myself, to be different than I am. Unity for France is uniformity. And what was so interesting about this is that even though Aisha was not representative of the many Muslim interlocutors that I had, some French Muslim youth felt fine and felt, French enough, certainly. But what was really interesting was this question of uniformity. France is a uniform place. And many of the French youth, sometimes I would go to the French Muslim high schools and they would give me the English class, like let me have the English class for the day. And I would draw pictures of France and I would draw pictures of the United States. And I would say, what do you think of when you think of France, or when you think of the US? And in France, there was this consistency of mentioning some kind of uniformity, a standardized way of life, and this specific set of characteristics that were mentioned over and over again, wherever I was. And what also stood out about what Aisha said was that it was very similar to what Samuel said. So Samuel was 25 when I met him. And we met while I was attending these catechism courses on Saturday mornings at a traditionalist Catholic church. Notably, there's many orders of traditionalist Catholicism. Traditionalist Catholicism is basically, you can think of the Catholicism from before the Second Vatican Council, but this one in particular is the Society for St. Pius X. So that organization, or that order, rejects the Second Vatican Council entirely. There is a strong rhetoric of royalism in their ideology, which is the return to the monarchy, the restoration of the monarchy, and a staunch rejection of the French Revolution as having been a positive thing for French society. So basically, in a nutshell, one of the priests that I interviewed there said to me that these principles, these French Republican principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity simply are not my Catholic Christian principles. So a little, pushback against democracy, a pushback certainly against secularism. And so what was interesting, particularly interesting about this case, again, I spoke to Catholics of all stripes and broad variety of Catholics, but this was the case that really stood out. So this is chapter 6 in the book, for example. What stood out was the way that they embodied Frenchness with this absolute resolve. And so Samuel is talking to me about France, and he says, France in its origins is one and indivisible. We are one nation, one culture, one identity. All that matters is that you're French, that you live like a French person. And what was so striking about this was that he was saying the same thing that Aisha was saying. So Samuel is over here saying that all that matters is that you live like a French person, but that there's only one kind of French person, right? That's one culture, one identity. And he is saying that with confident belonging. Aisha is saying the same thing, right? All that matters is living like a French person, this uniformity, right? But she's telling me this from the outside as someone who does not see herself as belonging. And again, just like the kids in the Muslim school classrooms who would describe French identity as something other than their own identities, just instinctively, that us versus them mentality was really deep rooted. And so the reason why this juxtaposition is so important is that it really begs this question of whether or not French secular values are really the gatekeepers of French identity. And why do I bring this up? So there's several scholars who have studied this question of sort of why are Muslims treated differently in France. And some scholars suggest that it's really about race, or it's about religion, or it's about the racialization of religion, or it's about socioeconomics. And that question of religion can be broken down into, oh well, Islam is incompatible with Western values, which I think we can all agree has been shown not to be the case at this point. And other folks say, oh well, it's because Islam can't be accepted by the host societies, etc., which has some clout as well. But there's this big camp of folks, and especially the government, who keep saying, oh well, it's really about secularism. So the scholars say, oh, well, secularism has this relationship with Catholicism and Christianity, which is really powerful, and so it excludes other religions. And so there's a lot to be said about that, which I'll get to in a moment. Then there's the government perspective that says, oh, well, anyone who adheres and adheres to and supports French secular values obviously can belong in France. And I think what my study shows more than anything else is that that is just not what's going on, right? So it's not French secular values. If it was, Samuel should also be excluded from French belonging, right? Because he belongs to the church, and even if he doesn't buy into all of the principles of the Society of St. Pius X, this whole organization is there operating and still gets cast as French. So what I suggest is happening instead is that this is actually francité at work. So I'll get to where I got this term from in a moment, but basically francité, as Daria pointed out at the beginning, it's this tacit national imaginary ideal type. The best way to think about it is it's what you think of when you think of what it means to be French, when you think of Frenchness. It's all those images and ideas that come rushing to mind. Just like if you were to say, what does it mean to be American? All those ideas and images that come rushing to mind, obviously complicated in this particular moment. But so, these are the conflations. They're not trying to tease out between race, religion, and ethnicity, but the conflations between those and the ways that they reinforce each other's exclusion, sociability, shared cultural markers, and sociocultural norms, right? That sociability is all about living like a French person. And so what I suggest, or the reason I use this term, it actually comes from Leopold Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal, arguably a French state puppet put into place. But his writings were really profound. And he originally wrote about negritude, or most famously wrote about negritude, which was this idea of Black African pride in their identities, and not losing that in the moment of decolonization, or under colonization, but also not losing that in the moment of decolonization. So he's writing about francité in this moment of decolonization, and he's saying that it's something for African nations to aspire to. So it's this opportunity, and it's the spirit of French civilization, meaning French culture. However, and this is where the reason why I used his version of the term, he specifically cautions that if France does not learn to decolonize, culturally decolonize, then francité will become a coercive concept that erases those other identities. And that is precisely what I think is going on in the French context. So I don't really have time to get into this, but I just want to share a couple photos before I return to my overarching argument. This is the traditionalist Catholic church that I worked in, the SSPX church. You'll note the headscarf, which really stood out to me while I was there. Most of the women who were, attending Mass always wore a headscarf, which was interesting in the context of headscarf debate, obviously. This was the catechism course that I sat in on, and the front of the church, the Party of France. I can talk about that later if you need be. These are some pictures from the French Muslim schools that I worked with. The top right is a group of French Muslim school leaders who come together to create one of the first private Muslim school organizations. This was a graduation at Averroès in Lille, which was particularly interesting because the cap is not usually used in graduation, so I had to go to a private Muslim school to find a cap in a graduation ceremony, which just sort of made me laugh. Okay, so what? So my overarching argument is that, this question of French national belonging is not about secularism, like so many folks argue, and like the state consistently argues, again, from very different perspectives, but it's really not about secularism. And what I think is really dangerous is that we throw secularism and whatever else is bound with it out with the bathwater of francité. So if we allow ourselves to say, okay, well, secularism is the thing that's doing harm here, then we should get rid of it. I think that's a really dangerous argument. So I think we need to understand that what's really the problem is the way that we're interpreting secularism in this particular context. And this, this stems or this goes beyond the French context. So you can think about how we're interpreting these secular democratic values um, from our national identity perspectives and how that might be perpetually excluding others. So basically, I argue that we need to shift the lenses through which we are collectively interpreting, right? These are these collective values. Um, and the ways that we're interpreting equality, liberty, fraternity, and secularism. And we need to make sure that we understand that there are majoritarian discourses of national identity, like francité, like other discourses in other places of the world. I'll leave that alone for now. They can distort and betray those values. So again, I feel like there's a betrayal of secularism going on in France that says, while politicians cast everything under the guise of secularism, oh, well, the reason we came up with these laws that specifically target Muslims, it's because of secularism and maintaining a secular public sphere. It's not. It's the protection of French national identity, right? And if we then say, okay, well, it's secularism that's being used to target folks, then you're betraying the good that can come from a secular society, right? We don't have a lot of other options for how to recognize and support our diverse and pluralistic societies. And so I think that these majoritarian discourses of national identity are betraying those. And that's really important to keep in mind. I included this just because I heard that we had some business folks who had signed up for the webinar. And this is actually the book from Pinder, Emaker, and Wadsworth is a book called Did That Just Happen? And it's absolutely about the corporate workplace. But I really thought it was interesting to include it here because it's, I'm certainly not naive enough to think that creating an inclusive workplace environment is the same as creating an inclusive country. But I do think it has some interesting, important undergirding principles in terms of how we can make sure that our implicit biases and the ways that they come together to create collective implicit biases, so our unconscious sentiments, ideas that come rushing to mind when we think of Frenchness, how we can prevent those from causing harm and perpetually marginalizing folks, whether it's in the workplace or in the nation. And so basically, I make this call for reimagining national identity and harnessing the power of the national imaginary, which we've seen done, but not necessarily or specifically not for the idea of creating a more inclusive society, but rather for the opposite. But if that sort of same harnessing of the national imaginary could be used for the betterment of an inclusive society, I think things would get a lot better. And I'll leave you with this quote from Ben Habib. Basically, this idea that the way we treat aliens, foreigners, and others in our midst is really this important test for our liberal democracies. And I think that's a really important lesson in this moment. And it's a lesson that I hope folks will get from this book and can apply to contexts elsewhere. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any and all questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was a wonderful presentation and a wonderful book. I have a couple notes that I'd like to share before we produce to the next part of this webinar, which is the Q&A. I personally cannot thank you enough for the wonderful presentation of such comprehensive research. I truly loved reading every single chapter with an extra appreciation of the conclusion for the way you brought together all the ideas you discuss throughout the entire book with a critical ending. I mean, for me, the conclusion was the food for thought part of the book, and you did a wonderful job there. The descriptions you provided were very well done, but as I was reading it, I found myself imagining you actually like actively being in the context at a church or at a Muslim school, making your observations, having conversations with your participants in those various settings. The chapter which resonated the most with me was naturally chapter 5, transmitting faith in the Republic, learning to be French in Muslim schools. And I said naturally because my research here in the US is on exploring citizenship education at an American Islamic school. So as I was reading that chapter, I was like taking notes for my own research to keep in mind to help me with my own work. Um, a big thing that I noticed in the book was the repetition of the word laïcité over and over as a core value to be French. Uh, Also coming from your participants, Muslims and non-Muslims both. And I found it definitely a key terminology in your work, and that we have to understand both the meaning and the practice of it within the French context, which is exactly what you aim to clarify uh, in your research. I thought that if a version of this book within the American context had been written, would it have been the same exact word? I said yes and no at the same time. While I can see the word secular being discussed in a hypothetical American version of this book, then I thought probably a term which had the high potential to replace it would be freedom or religious freedom uh, in an American context. I have two questions on my own before we accept questions from the audience. Could you also explain a little bit for those of us who are novice researchers in ethnography, um, like how you conducted this 10 years of research? Uh, as far as I know, you were not in France for the whole 10 years, right? You kept going back and forth. Like, how have you made your connections? How have you maintained those connections? The language obstacles. I also know that you speak French fluently, but in the book, you also talk about sometimes how you spoke with people in English. So, could you please like explain the method or the methods you used over 10 years and how many research like IRB approvals did you have to get? So
Yes, yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So now I can't remember if I mentioned this, but so the research originally, the seed was planted in 2004, and I didn't go on to do research for a long time after. But in 2009 to 2011, I did a master's degree or a dual master's degree at the American University in Paris in Islam and Middle Eastern Studies, and that was really the first part of this research, and that is where I really became interested in private Muslim schools. So private Muslim schools in France are state funded or can be state funded, I should clarify, due to an interesting loophole in France's secularism or laïcité, which I used secularism in the talk to maintain some consistency and resonance with the audience, but I do use laïcité in the book. Um, and so I was particularly interested in how these French Muslim schools were navigating this secular context. And that school was, or that study was particularly focused on just schools. So I was looking at public schools and Catholic schools and Muslim schools to look at how students were learning about religion and how that might influence their tolerance and understanding of other folks of other religions. So that was the beginning, and that's where I first met some of the Muslim school actors. So that was back in 2010. And I have maintained, and I sent a text message this morning to someone I met at that time to invite them to the webinar. So, for example, I've stayed in touch with those folks for a really long time. Which also means, when I started this context, there were only like a handful of Muslim schools, and today there's 100. There's still not very many who are state funded, and one school that I've been working with almost since its founding just lost its funding this year, so that was really notable. But so basically, it took me a lot of time to build trust within those Muslim school communities. Um, I was a little bit more accepted because I was an American. That was really helpful. I think it mattered that I was a woman. Um, this made fieldwork complicated in certain contexts, as being a woman scholar in lots of contexts is complicated. However, I think it reduced a barrier of entry for me. and actually made it easier for me to gain access to certain communities. But it took a lot of trust building. So Avarez, I always say, I write in this chapter 5, I just kept showing up. And eventually Hassan Ufker, who was the principal of that school for years, finally was like, fine, you can come. And then, again, we still now exchange texts and whatnot. He's no longer at the school, but so it's trust building over time. The Catholic communities were really different. It was less sort of proving myself and more like, it was less proving myself ahead of time. It was more proving myself in the context. So, I had to sign up for the catechism courses and promise to come to all of them. For the traditionalist catechism classes, those are actually open to the public, which I thought was really interesting because that's where some of the most controversial language I heard about the rejection of French secular Republican values came. So walk in, anyone can hear it, which again really provides this juxtaposition with what Muslim schools are able to do. And so, it was a lot of trust building. As I said, I was in the field so I was living in France to do the master's degree from 2009 to 2011. Then I came back 2013 to 2015. Then I came back in 2019, 2020. And I also went every summer anyways for family, with family. And so that was sort of how the research worked. But let's say, like I said, I left the field in 2015, right before the Charlie Hebdo attacks. So I had all my research ideas and I started writing. The attacks happened right after, and that year was like catastrophic for France and trying to understand, make sense of Islam. The schools were undergoing a lot of surveillance, extra surveillance. So I was always in dialogue with the youth from the schools who would message me and say, "Oh, Carol, do you know what's happening at the school? They're watching us and they're asking us questions about how we feel about the Charlie Hebdo attacks." So I really maintained contact with a lot of folks from the field, which helped, to understand the evolution of things. And then, like I said, in 2019, 2020, I went back focusing on independent schools in France, so of all stripes, but also Muslim schools, which allowed me to sort of revisit some of the sites, see what was going on, and kind of complete that picture. But certainly, my identity mattered a lot for gaining access, and being American was probably the number one thing because of the skepticism of French researchers in the Muslim schooling communities. That's changed a little bit, but there's still a lot of distrust, especially with the recent events of the one school having their funding pulled. So hopefully that speaks to your question a little bit. The
Thank you.
writing process is really long, though.
Yes, you said that to me before
Yes.
with my own dissertation. I do have another question, but I realize that we have about 15 minutes left. So I'd like to invite our participants, our audience, to shoot their questions. You can just post it in the chat box and I will read it out aloud for you.
And if there's none immediately, you could ask another
Yes.
question in the meantime.
Or yeah, how about I ask my next question while people type in their questions? One thing I didn't necessarily see in your book was I saw it being Muslim, like a Muslim identity. I saw you talking about the French identity, but I didn't necessarily see a French Muslim identity being combined. And I'm asking this question in comparison to the American context here because American Muslims, right? That's a term that's being used. We always talk about American Muslims. Um, so why is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think it was my intention not to write it that way. I do. Certainly in the school context, they voiced that they were working towards helping French youth or French Muslim youth to understand that identity as being coherent. But the major reason why these identities are usually separated, is echoed in both Aisha and Samuel's statements, that question of uniformity and that one identity, and that one identity is French. And so if you're not French, or if you don't feel like you belong in that identity and don't fit into that identity, or that you've been told your entire life that you don't fit into that identity, then, my Muslim interlocutors, that especially the Muslim youth, would consistently say, "Oh, well, French, um, the French do this or that." And I would ask them, "But aren't you French?" And they would say, "Well, yes, but you know what I mean." And so it was just this consistent narrative of feeling like those identities were separated, and that they could not be both at the same time. Now, what's interesting about that too is that the French Muslim community writ large is really fragmented, and so there's a lot of disagreement about what French Muslim identity should be and should look like, and that also plays a role in making it harder for folks to think of themselves as this one identity. Whereas, um, in the American context, we're so used to a very pluralistic way of thinking about things, right? There's the federal government, but then there's all the states, and every the states all do different things and have your communities, but you can still feel like you belong to this other American Muslim identity. And I think that is different in France, and I think a lot of that stems from francité, that rejection of anything else being the most important part of your identity.
So I got a note from my supervisor as you were answering the question that the Q&A was disabled. So
Oh,
um,
okay. Well, someone
oh,
has
here you
their hand
go.
raised, and now there is a question in the.
Yeah. Everybody, please type your questions in the Q&A instead of raising your hands. That would be more convenient for us to continue with the session. So do you see the question,
I
Carol?
do. So, do you have suggestions for actions that can be taken by the French government in this regard? Um, so, I write pretty critically of a lot of the policies that have been made in the last several years. Um, I think that they have been made again in, you know, um, they've been made to look like they were in favor of secularism, right? The one law from 2021 is um, the law to support French Republican values, right? That's like the name of the law, and it specifically targets Muslims, and many of its parts are really there to police who does and doesn't belong, and really to protect national identity. And so the first thing I would suggest to the government, should I ever be given Macron's ear, would be to stop making policies that specifically target an already marginalized group in the country. I think it's not only problematic in terms of creating an inclusive society, but I think it makes society more dangerous because you attract um, actors from, international organizations that can manipulate those tragedies and travesties that are happening within the country, where people feel constantly pushed out. Like, look at Aisha, who decided, okay, well, I can't stay here then. So you're pushing people out, and you're drawing the wrong attention to the state by continuously creating these policies that target Muslims. um, and I think a lot of work could be done in education and in policy making to reduce that pressure and make people feel like they belong, which I think would lead to a more vibrant civil society, and also just a safer state, honestly.
We have one more question in the chat, in the Q&A, sorry. Can you share examples of other communities other than churches and mosques in France that address this issue properly or find ways to do so despite these laws, such as schools, community centers, etc.?
Um, that embrace inclusivity. I wonder if that's what that question is meant to imply. Um, so I would say, okay. So I cannot give strong examples of communities that have done this. Um, in France, a long alongside francité, there's, and this resonates with what Samuel says, there's this strong um, pressure against what they call communitarisme, which is like a group, any kind of splitting off of a group um, from that French national identity. And so what I what I would suggest is that it's really pervasive throughout French culture of this idea of this one identity. The one group I will note that I worked with, now that's coming to mind, was Coexister. Coexister was founded like just before I was in the field. I want to say 2012 was the first time they launched their like world tour, um, and they brought together Muslim. They sent on tour a Muslim, a Jewish person, Muslim, and like an atheist and an agnostic, and a Catholic. If I didn't already mention that one, and they sent them on this world tour together to sort of represent this coexiste, like coexistence. And they did a lot of great work in France, and actually had the government's ear at one point, and were making a difference. That was under Hollande more so. And things really changed actually in 2016, when Macron came to office. But that is one group that I would use as an example of a organization that was really doing a great job of trying to build an inclusive space.
So a question relevant to that just came about interfaith spaces that you spent time in. Are those spaces, are those productive spaces for societal change? How are those spaces perceived by the Muslim, Catholic, and others that participate?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in these interfaith spaces, and I was specifically trying to understand, if Catholics are coming to the table from this majority status, and notably the priests are being sent and paid by the church, right? Like it's their full-time job to be part of these events. In some cases, not in all cases, there were ordinary Catholics who would come, participate as well. But the priests who were there were usually, it was like part of their mission, versus the Muslim leaders who were there, who were also, for example, like engineers at a university, an engineering professor, also taught at a private Muslim school, and also was like the ostensible like head leader of interfaith dialogue in certain regions of France. So those different dynamics really mattered. And whether or not they're productive, this is something I speak to in the end of chapter 2. They seem really exciting and productive from the outside. There's tons of these events. They all seem like they're really hopeful. But then when I would speak to folks afterwards, there was this sort of letdown kind of experience, like, oh, I was really hopeful, but we really just came together to talk about what's wrong with Islam. Or we really just came together to talk about what our faiths have in common, right? And we're not really getting anywhere. There's no productivity. The places where I saw the most productive interfaith dialogue was um, in the Coexiste, and then also in this one Catholic school that I spent time in that had interfaith, like a interfaith unit throughout the year, where they would break into groups, and they would have a rabbi and a Muslim leader and a priest help lead them in this dialogue activity throughout the year. And that is where I saw like the most productive spaces of interfaith dialogue. But I think all that high level dialogue, any kind of nationally sponsored dialogue or something put on by the state where they invite everyone, or you're just leaders sitting around talking, tends not to be very productive, and it's all for show and causes all sorts of other issues. And in terms of how they're perceived, I mean, I think the problem is like when Muslims would participate, sometimes they would actually lose their followers. So if a Muslim leader, like an imam, for example, who was well known at a particular mosque, started participating in interfaith dialogue, sometimes they would lose their followers for various problematic reasons that I don't have time to get into. Whereas the priests also would sometimes be subject to critique by their peers, because the clergy is moving to be more conservative, and so the conservative actors disapprove of this interfaith dialogue, and so they would also face some rejection. So it was contentious to participate in dialogue, which was in and of itself an interesting dynamic.
Before we jump to the next question, I have another question because I think it might be a little relevant. How about the intrafaith dynamics within the Muslim community?
Yeah, so those were really contentious as well. And some of the interfaith dialogues that I went to had Muslim actors who, I had interviewed or spoken with separately, who spoke very ill of the others in the room, and who, staunchly disagreed with them on how Islam should be organized in France, who should be in charge, how you should decide who should be in charge. What an Islam of France or in France should look like. Um, and so that was a really important thing. And that's another way that France is able to continue to suppress this minority is because of some of those intra-faith dynamics being so fierce.
We have another question. Bonjour. A most favorite special Jewish carpenter famously stated about 2,000 years ago that the sheep know the sound of the shepherd's voice. There is a special resonance in the shepherd's voice. Was there any exploration of the truths and realities of the sacred writings of the Gospels and the Quran?
So in the catechism classes that I attended, there was a lot of conversation about the Gospels, and various interpretations of them. They were always sort of interpreted by the leader of the catechism classes, so those um, interpretations were often very different depending on which church I was sitting in, especially the traditionalist Catholic Society of St. Pius X Church. Um, and yes, we talked about the Quran extensively. A lot of the interfaith dialogues focused on violent verses of the Quran and how we can interpret them. And again, that was part of my writing, was trying to understand why we were always only talking about the violent verses of the Quran and leaving out any of the violent verses um, in the older New Testament.
Are there any other questions, everyone? I guess not. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you so much for Carol for sharing your research with us. It's always a pleasure to host you, either in person or virtually.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate this great turnout and attendance. It means a lot to me to be able to present this work. And thank you so much, Daria. And thank you so much to everyone who took time out of their day to listen. And I wish
Mhm.
I had a book code for you. I don't, but if you email me, I can try and get one. I thought of that this morning, but so thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone.